The sky over Xylos-Four looked like a bruised lung, heavy with violet clouds and the shimmering dust of pulverized mercury. Below, the landscape was nothing but a jagged sea of crystalline formations that hummed with a low, bone-deep vibration. Every step I took sent a ripple through the translucent ground, as if the planet itself were an eye watching me blink. "Keep your head on a swivel, Kay," Lyraia murmured through the comlink. Her voice was a velvet rasp that usually calmed my nerves, but today it felt like sandpaper. The resonance readings are spiking. This canyon doesn't like us being here. I adjusted the strap of my pulse rifle, the familiar weight of the composite stock pressing against my shoulder. I was dressed in a weathered tactical suit, the thermal plating scratched from a dozen close calls on planets far less beautiful and far more lethal than this one. My bare forearms, scarred by shrapnel and years of hard labor in the outer rim, felt the chill of the thinning atmosphere. "I'm moving, Lyra. Just give me the coordinates and quit worrying about the terrain." "I know my way around a rock pile," I grunted, kicking a loose shard of glass that went tinkling into the abyss below. "You're heading 3 degrees off course, you stubborn ape," she countered. I could practically hear her rolling her eyes back at the landing craft. Humans and their inner ears. Honestly, it's a miracle your species didn't walk yourselves off a cliff 10,000 years ago. Lyraia was a Sirenite, a species that valued precision and harmony above all else. To her, my existence was a series of fortunate accidents. She was currently perched on a ridge 2 kilometers away, her luminescent skin probably glowing a soft, agitated teal as she monitored the local frequencies. We had been partners for 6 months, a duration that qualified as a lifetime in the artifact hunting business. The hegemony of Accord paid well for prehistory salvage, but they didn't pay for failures. I rounded a pillar of obsidian that stood like a frozen titan. The air here was different. It didn't just vibrate, it sang. It was a high-pitched metallic keening that made my teeth ache. "Kay, stop!" Lyra's voice lost its playful edge. "The signature. It's right in front of you. But there's something wrong. The energy levels they're not following the standard laws of thermodynamics." I saw it then. In the center of a natural amphitheater made of pure, unblemished quartz sat a block of matte black stone. It seemed to drink the light around it, a void in the middle of a world of reflections. And buried deep into that stone was a hilt. It wasn't ornate. There were no jewels, no gold filigree, no boastful inscriptions. It was a utilitarian piece of dark metal, wrapped in a grip that looked like weathered leather but felt, as I approached, like something far older. The blade was buried to the crossguard, but the exposed metal pulsed with a rhythmic, sapphire light. "Holy Mother of God," I whispered. "Don't touch it," Lyra shouted. "Kay, I'm reading the logs from the previous expeditions. 3 Valerian shock troopers tried to pull that thing out 40 years ago. Their nervous systems were fried before they could even exert pressure. A Draxian juggernaut tried using a gravity winch 2 decades later. The winch imploded. That object has a bio-locked defense grid that hasn't been breached in recorded history. I didn't listen. I couldn't. There was a pull in my chest, a gravity that had nothing to do with the planet. It was as if my very blood was being summoned by the metal in that stone. I stepped onto the black pedestal, my boots silent against the void material. "Kaylin!" Lyra was screaming now. "Get out of there. The hegemony sensors are going to pick up the surge. This is a zero contact zone." I reached out. My hand was shaking, not from fear, but from a strange, frantic anticipation. My fingers closed around the hilt. The world didn't end. I didn't turn to ash. Instead, a shockwave of warmth flooded my arm, racing through my veins like liquid sunlight. The sapphire pulse of the blade stabilized, turning into a steady, brilliant glow that matched the thumping of my own heart. The symbols on the hilt shifted. They weren't alien. They were a script so ancient it felt like the foundation of all language. It was the tongue of my ancestors, written in the stars long before Earth was even a cradle. I heard the sound of 1,000 voices shouting in a language I shouldn't know. "Rise." I pulled. The sword slid out of the obsidian block as if it were moving through water. There was no friction, no resistance, only the soft musical ring of metal meeting air. The blade was a sliver of darkness edged in blue fire, 5 feet of impossible geometry that felt lighter than a feather in my hand. The ground groaned. A pillar of blue light erupted from the pedestal, piercing the violet clouds of Xylos-Four and tearing a hole straight through to the stars above. "Kay?" Lyra's voice was a tiny, fragile thing in my ear. "What did you do?" "I did what they couldn't," I said, my voice sounding deeper, resonant with a power that wasn't mine. "I took what belongs to us." "Check the sensors," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You didn't just pull a sword, Kalen. You just rang a bell that every predator in the sector's going to hear. Get your ass back to the ship. Now!" I didn't move for a second, staring at the blade. In its reflection, my eyes weren't brown anymore. They were glowing with the same fierce, ancient blue as the steel. I felt a surge of adrenaline, a jagged, electric joy. "Let them come," I muttered, sheathing the blade onto the magnetic locks of my suit. The sword didn't just fit, it felt like a missing limb had finally been restored. I turned and began to run, the glass desert blurring into a streak of color. I wasn't just a scavenger anymore. I was a man carrying a key to a door the universe had tried very hard to keep locked. The roar of descending engines shattered the silence of Xylos-Four. I didn't need Lyra's sensors to tell me we had company. The hegemony didn't waste time when their precious laws were broken. Two interceptor-class vessels, sleek and silver like predatory fish, cut through the clouds. They were dropping fast, their belly cannons warming up with a telltale orange hum. "Kay!" Lyra screamed. "They've got a lock on you! Bug out to the ravine at 10 o'clock!" I didn't argue. I threw myself over the edge of the crystal ridge, my boots sliding against the slick surface. I fired my suit's microthrusters to break the fall, landing hard in a cloud of powdered silica. The orange beams of the interceptors scorched the ridge I had just occupied, turning the quartz into molten slag. "Those bastards aren't asking for credentials," I yelled, sprinting toward the shadows of the ravine. "Of course not." Lyra's voice was frantic, accompanied by the frantic clicking of her consoles. "You just bypassed a level 10 security lock on an atavistic artifact. In their book, that makes you a dead man walking. I'm spinning up the engines on the Stellar Nomad. I'll meet you at the extraction point in 5 minutes. If you're late, I'm leaving your sorry human hide to the crows." "5 minutes? You're getting soft, Lyra." I huffed, leaping over a fissure that breathed out cold, blue gas. I felt a tingle at the base of my neck. The sword on my back was humming again. It wasn't just noise, it was a warning. I skidded to a halt just as a squad of hegemony enforcers materialized from the haze. They were Valerians, six-eyed bipedals encased in heavy, white power armor. Their pulse rifles were leveled at my chest. "Halt, primate!" the lead enforcer barked, his voice translated into a harsh metallic rasp. "Surrender the artifact and prepare for immediate liquidation." "Liquidate this, you overgrown squid," I spat. I didn't reach for my rifle. My hand moved to the sword hilt on my shoulder. The moment my fingers touched the grip, time seemed to dilate. I could see the individual pulses of light in the Valerians' weapons. I could see the microscopic cracks in their armor. I drew the blade. A wave of blue kinetic energy exploded outward. The enforcers weren't just hit. They were tossed back like autumn leaves in a hurricane. I didn't even have to swing. The sword was acting as a conductor for the planet's own resonant energy. I didn't stick around to see them get up. I pushed my legs to their limit, the sword's energy flowing into my suit, boosting my speed until my lungs burned. Another vision hit me then. It wasn't a slow fade-in. It was a violent intrusion. I saw a sky filled with thousands of ships, not the clunky, bolted-together vessels of the hegemony, but elegant, golden spires that moved with the grace of living things. I saw men and women in white armor standing on the bridges, their faces stern, but filled with a fierce, protective love. They weren't conquerors. They were the Aegis. "We are the wall," a voice whispered in the back of my skull. "We are the silence between the screams." "Kalen! Wake up!" Lyra's voice pulled me back just as I nearly ran face first into a crystal spire. "You're flatlining on the comms. What's happening?" "Just some ghosts," I wheezed, shaking my head to clear the golden dust of the vision. "I'm at the extraction point." "Where are you?" the stellar nomad roared over the canyon rim, its landing gear extending like the talons of a hawk. The cargo ramp hissed open before the ship even touched the ground. Lyra was at the top of the ramp, her blue skin shimmering under the emergency lights, her hands flying over a handheld terminal. "Get in! Get in!" she yelled, firing her sidearm at the approaching interceptors. I leaped onto the ramp, the magnetic locks catching my boots as the ship began a hard burn ascent. The G-force slammed me into the floor, but I didn't let go of the sword. I couldn't. Lyra slammed the hatch shut and scrambled to the cockpit. I followed, stumbling into the co-pilot seat as we breached the upper atmosphere. Behind us, the interceptors were shrinking, but their long-range scanners were still locked on. "We're not out of the woods yet," Lyra said, her fingers dancing across the flight controls. "They've flagged us as terrorists. Every hegemony gate is going to be closed to us." "Kay, what the hell is that thing?" She pointed at the sword resting across my lap. It was dark again, the blue fire replaced by a faint, steady throb. "It's a key," I said, my voice still shaking, "and I think it just told me that everything we know about history is a lie." She looked at me then, her glowing eyes searching mine. For the first time, I saw something other than annoyance or professional curiosity. I saw fear, but beneath it, there was a spark of the same curiosity that had cost her her home. "The hegemony calls us scavengers, Kaylin," she said softly, turning back to the stars. "But if you're right, we just stole the only thing that matters in this entire godforsaken galaxy." I leaned back, the weight of the sword pressing against my legs. I knew she was right. We weren't just hunters anymore. We were targets. "Where to?" Lyra asked, her hand hovering over the jump drive engagement. I closed my eyes, and for a second a map appeared in my mind. A hidden sector shrouded in nebulae, a place the modern charts said was empty. "Sector 9G, I said. "There's something waiting for us there." She didn't ask how I knew. She just slammed the lever forward, and the stars stretched into long, white lines of light. As we plummeted into the void, I realized that for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the dark. I was the one carrying the candle. But candles have a way of attracting things that live in the shadows, and the shadows of this galaxy were very, very deep. The jump into hyperspace felt like being squeezed through a straw by a giant. My stomach did a slow, lazy somersault somewhere behind my ribs, and for a few seconds the universe outside the viewport smeared into a kaleidoscope of screaming white light. Then, with a muffled thump that vibrated through the hull of the stellar nomad, we were in the slipstream. The violent shaking subsided into a steady rhythmic thrum, the heartbeat of a ship pushing itself to the absolute limit. I stayed in the co-pilot seat for a long time, staring at my hands. They were still trembling. The skin on my palms felt tight, buzzing with a phantom heat that wouldn't dissipate. Beside me, Lyraia was a blur of motion. Her fingers, long and tipped with delicate, bioluminescent pads, danced across the holographic interface of the navigation console. She was plotting 3 different decoy vectors, a standard Sirianite evasive maneuver designed to confuse the long-range arrays of any pursuing hegemony cruisers. "We're in the pipe, Kay," she said, her voice dropping from its frantic screech to a low, melodic hum. "But don't get comfortable. We didn't exactly cover our tracks back there. That blue pillar of light was visible from the next moon over. Every bounty hunter from here to the Crimson Rim is probably checking their fuel levels right now." I didn't answer. My gaze was fixed on the atavistic key. It lay across the dashboard, looking deceptively simple. In the dim, red emergency lighting of the cockpit, the blade didn't look like an ancient superweapon. It looked like a piece of sharpened shadow. It seemed to absorb the ambient light, creating a localized pocket of darkness that felt heavier than the rest of the room. "Kaylin?" Lyra turned her chair to face me. The glow from her skin had faded to a calm, silvery gray, but her eyes were sharp, searching. "Talk to me. You went somewhere else back there, on the ridge. And don't tell me it was just the adrenaline. I've seen you outrun a pack of Ravagers without breaking a sweat." This was different. I rubbed my face, feeling the grit and sweat of Xylos-Four. "I'm fine, Lyra, just a bit rattled. It's not every day you pull a legendary toothpick out of a rock and get a face full of ancient history." "I'm not a child, Kaylin," she snapped, her voice tightening with a hint of that Sirenite resonance that made the air vibrate. "I saw your eyes. They weren't just reflecting the blade. They were glowing. And your vitals. For 10 seconds, the ship's internal sensors couldn't even find your heartbeat. You were ghosted, Kay, physically present but biologically elsewhere. I looked at her, seeing the genuine worry beneath her professional mask. We had been together through some rough skags. We'd survived a vacuum leak in the Ophiuchus sector and a shootout with a hegemony tax collector on Velanus Prime. I trusted her with my life, but how do you explain to someone that you've just seen the birth of an empire you didn't know existed? It's the sword, I said, leaning back and closing my eyes. It's not just a weapon, it's a bridge. When I touched it, it was like a floodgate open. I saw things, Lyra. Ships, thousands of them, and people, humans, but not like us. They weren't scavengers or third-tier citizens living on the scraps of the galaxy. They were the architects. They were the ones who built the gates we use every day. They called themselves the Aegis. Lyra went silent. I opened my eyes to find her staring at the blade with a mixture of awe and terror. The Aegis, she whispered. That's a myth, a nursery rhyme told to human children to make them feel better about being the galactic underdog. The hegemony archives say humans were a late-blooming species, discovered on a backwater rock called Earth only 3,000 years ago. The archives are a lie, I said, my voice sounding hollow even to my own ears. Or at least, they're only half the truth. We didn't just appear, we returned, or we were left behind. I don't know yet, but the sword knows. It recognized me. It didn't just react to my DNA, it reacted to my intent. Intent? Lyra stood up, pacing the small confines of the bridge. The deck plates clattered under her light footsteps. That's not how technology works, Kay. Machines don't care about intent. They care about protocols, authorizations, and energy signatures. If that thing is responding to your feelings, then it's not a sword. It's a sentient biological interface. Whatever it is, we need to hide it, I said, reaching for the hilt. The moment my skin brushed the metal, another flash hit me. It wasn't a full vision this time, just a sharp, jagged memory of a cold, dark room and the smell of ozone. I saw a man, his face obscured by a visor, handing a similar blade to a younger soldier. Fear is the anchor, boy, the man said. Courage is the wind. You cannot have one without the other. If you are not afraid, you are a fool. If you do not move despite the fear, you are a corpse. I pulled my hand back, gasping. Kay! Lyra was at my side, her cool blue fingers gripping my shoulder. Easy, breathe. You're shaking like a leaf. I'm okay, I lied, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I need a minute. You need more than a minute. You need a drink and a medical scan, she said. But her tone was softer now. She guided me out of the cockpit and into the small galley. The Stellar Nomad was a converted long-range scout vessel, cramped and smelling of recycled air and old coffee. But it was home. It was the only place in the galaxy where I didn't feel like a guest. I sat at the small, bolted-down table while Lyra rummaged through the storage lockers. She pulled out a bottle of synthetic amber ale and 2 glasses. She poured them with a steady hand, despite the fact that our lives were currently being hunted by the most powerful organization in known space. To not being dead yet, she said, raising her glass. To the little things, I replied, taking a long pull of the bitter liquid. It burned all the way down, but it helped ground me. We sat in silence for a few minutes, the only sound the hum of the life support systems. The theme of my life had always been survival. I'd run from the military, run from my debts, and run from the crushing weight of being a human in a universe that didn't want us. But for the first time, I felt like I was running towards something, and that terrified me more than any hegemony cruiser. Lyra, I said, looking at her over the rim of my glass, why did you stay? Back there on Xylos-Four, you could have taken the ship and left when the interceptors showed up. You would have been clean. You could have told the hegemony I went rogue and you tried to stop me. She looked at me, her silvery skin rippling with a hint of purple, the color of Sirenite frustration. Because you're a moron, Kaylin Vance, a stubborn, reckless, direction-challenged moron. And because you're the only person who's ever looked at me and seen a partner instead of a specialized tool. She leaned forward, her eyes intense. My people, the Sirenites, we are valued for our resonance, our ability to speak to machines and hear the whispers of the void. We are treated like high-end computers. But you? You argue with me. You make fun of my hair. You treat me like I have a choice. I reached across the table and touched her hand. Her skin was cool, almost like polished stone, but there was a pulse beneath it that felt remarkably human. Family isn't just about who you share a bloodline with, Lyra. It's about who you choose to bleed for. She squeezed my hand back, a small, sad smile touching her lips. Then I suppose we're both fools, because we are definitely going to bleed for that sword. I looked back toward the cockpit, where the atavistic key was still pulsing its slow sapphire light. I felt the fear again, cold and sharp. But I also felt something else, a spark of defiance. If the Aegis had been the wall, then maybe it was time for the wall to be rebuilt. We have 6 hours until we hit the jump gate for Sector 9G, Lyra said, standing up and clearing the glasses. Go to your bunk, Kay. Get some sleep. If that thing starts talking to you again, tell it to wait until morning. I nodded, standing up and feeling the exhaustion finally catch up to me. I made my way to the small sleeping quarters, but as I passed the sword, I couldn't help but stop. I reached out, not to touch it, but just to feel the air around it. It felt electric, alive. I laid down in my bunk, but sleep was a long time coming. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the golden ships and the burning stars. I saw the faces of 1,000 kings, all of them looking at me with eyes that knew my secrets. I was just a scavenger from the dirt, but the universe had decided I was something else. I fell into an uneasy slumber, dreaming of a storm made of glass and a voice that kept repeating the same 3 words. The key awakens. Outpost 0 didn't exist on any official hegemony map. It was a hollowed-out asteroid, 3 kilometers of jagged rock and pressurized steel, drifting in the gravitational shadow of a dead gas giant in Sector 9G. It was a haven for the ghosted, the exiled, and the desperate. It smelled of ozone, scorched lubricant, and the sour tang of too many species crowded into too little space. The stellar nomad drifted into the main docking bay with a series of jerky hissed corrections from its thrusters. Lyra was doing her best to look inconspicuous, which was difficult given that our ship was currently trailing a faint trail of sapphire-tinted ion particles. Keep your head down, Kay, she whispered through the internal comms as the landing gear groaned against the metal deck. I don't like the look of the crowd on the observation deck. There are too many long coats and not enough grease monkeys. I checked the atavistic key. I had wrapped it in a heavy lead-lined canvas roll and strapped it to my back. It felt like a bar of solid ice against my spine, its weight somehow greater now that we were back in a gravity well. I pulled a tattered duster over my tactical suit, hiding the sword and the various pouches of scavenged tech I always carried. We're just here for a trade, I reminded her, more than myself. We see Varax, we get the intel, and we ghost, no distractions. Lyra joined me at the airlock, her hood pulled low over her Sirenite features. She carried a compact pulse pistol tucked into her waistband, her movements fluid and alert. We stepped out onto the docking bay floor, and the cacophony of the station hit us like a physical blow. The air was thick with the sounds of a dozen languages, the clicking of insectoid Chthul, the wet gurgle of the Sarlachi, and the sharp, clipped tones of human smugglers. Overhead, massive cranes groaned as they moved crates of illegal thorium and black market medical supplies. We made our way through the crowd, heading for the lower tiers. This was where the real business of Outpost 0 happened, far away from the prying eyes of the station's self-appointed governors. We passed a group of Draxian mercenaries, their forearms crossed over their massive chests, their red eyes tracking us as we walked by. 200 marks says they're looking for a payday, Lyra muttered, her hand twitching near her holster. Don't take the bet, I replied, my eyes scanning the shadows. We reached a door marked with a faded, rusted symbol of a skull entwined with a gear. I knocked a specific rhythm, 3 fast, 2 slow, 1 heavy. A small shutter slid open, a pair of yellow reptilian eyes peering out at us. Vance, a gravelly voice hissed. You're late, and you're hot. The word is out, Kalen. You poked the hive on Xylos-Four. Open the door, Varax, I said, my voice low and dangerous, or I'll find someone else to spend my credits on. The door hissed open, revealing a cramped, dimly lit room filled with the hum of illegal servers and the smell of fermented fungus. Vrax was a Skal, a hunched, scaly humanoid with a penchant for high-end cybernetics and low-end morals. His left arm was a gleaming piece of chrome, and one of his eyes had been replaced with a multispectral sensor that whirred as it focused on me. Come in, he croaked, gesturing us toward a pair of sagging chairs. But make it fast. The hegemony has put a bounty on your head that could buy a small moon. 300,000 marks, dead or alive. Preferable dead. 300,000? Lyra whistled. I knew I should have asked for a raise. Shut it, Lyra, I grunted, sitting down. Vrax, I need to know about the atavistic key. And don't give me the legend. I want the history they took out of the books. Vrax leaned back, his mechanical eye spinning. The key. You actually got it. I didn't think a human had the stones. Or the luck. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a small data-sharded disk. This cost me 3 contacts and a very expensive bribe to a hegemony archivist. He slid the disk across the table. I didn't touch it. Tell me what's on it first. History is a funny thing, Kalen, Vrax said, his tongue flicking out to moisten his dry lips. It's written by the winners. And 5,000 years ago, the hegemony didn't exist. The galaxy was ruled by the Aegis. They weren't just a species, they were a collective. Humans, Sirenites, even some early Skal. They worked together to push back something called the Entropists, beings from the void who wanted to turn the stars into cold ash. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. The Aegis won, but the cost was too high. The Entropists couldn't be killed, only imprisoned. So the Aegis built a cage, a network of stations and shields that spanned the entire galaxy. But to keep the cage shut, they had to stay vigilant. They had to be the guardians. Then what happened? Lyra asked, her voice tight with fascination. They got tired, Vrax said simply. Power corrupts, but peace stagnates. Internal wars broke out. The collective fractured. The humans, who were the primary architects of the cage, decided that the only way to save the galaxy from itself was to disappear. They wiped their own history, dismantled their fleets, and hid the keys to the cage on backwater worlds. They chose to become insignificant so that the power they held couldn't be used for the wrong reasons. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the station's failing heaters. They chose to forget, I asked. They left us in the dirt, struggling to survive, while the hegemony took over. It was a sacrifice, Kalen, Vrax said, a desperate one. But the cage is failing. The Entropists are waking up. And the hegemony, they don't want to be guardians. They want the keys so they can use the cage's power for themselves. They don't realize that if they turn the key the wrong way, the door opens for everyone. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the docking bay outside. The floor shook, and the high-pitched wail of a station-wide alarm began to scream. They're here, Lyra said, jumping to her feet and drawing her pistol. Vrax cursed, his mechanical arm whirring as he grabbed a heavy scattergun from under the table. You need to move, Vance. The back exit leads to the ventilation shafts. It'll take you straight to docking bay 7. What about the Nomad? I asked, grabbing the data disk. Forget the ship, Lyra shouted, grabbing my arm. We can't get back to bay 3. The enforcers will have it swarmed. We need to find another way off this rock. We scrambled out the back door just as the front entrance exploded in a shower of sparks and metal. I looked back for a split second and saw the white armored forms of hegemony shock troops pouring into the room. We ran. The ventilation shafts were cramped, hot, and filled with the stench of stagnant air. I could hear the rhythmic thud of boots on metal echoing through the vents, closer than I liked. The atavistic key was a heavy burden on my back, but I felt its power hum in response to my fear. It wasn't trying to take over this time. It was offering a steady, calming pulse, like a hand on my shoulder. We reached a junction where the air felt slightly cooler. Lyra kicked a grate open, and we dropped 5 meters into a maintenance corridor. We were in the bowels of the station now, where the massive fusion reactors roared with a terrifying intensity. This way, Lyra pointed toward a heavy blast door. If we can get through the reactor shielding, there's a small emergency scout vessel kept for the engineers. We reached the door, but it was locked. Lyra pressed her palms against the control panel, her eyes closed, her skin glowing a fierce electric blue. She was trying to talk to the station's ancient, decaying computer. "Come on, baby," she whispered. "Just one little click." The sound of gunfire erupted behind us. A group of bounty hunters, 3 humans and a scarred Krogan, had found us. They were using the reactor pillars for cover, their heavy rounds pinging off the metal walls around us. "Kay, do something!" Lyra yelled, her voice strained. "I didn't think. I couldn't." I reached over my shoulder and drew the atavistic key. The blade didn't just glow, it screamed. A wave of blue light filled the corridor, so bright it blinded the attackers. I stepped forward, swinging the blade in a wide arc. I didn't hit anyone, but the kinetic pulse sent the mercenaries flying backward, their weapons shattering against the walls. The blast door hissed open. "Go!" I shouted, grabbing Lyra and shoving her through the opening. We found ourselves in a small, cramped hangar. A single needle-shaped scout ship sat on the pad, its engines already humming with a low-power standby mode. We scrambled inside and I slammed the airlock shut. Lyra took the pilot's seat, her hands shaking as she initialized the launch sequence. "Kaylin, that was... You didn't even touch them?" "I know," I said, looking at the blade in my hand. "It's getting stronger. Or I am." We felt the ship lurch as the docking clamps released. We shot out into the void of Sector 9G just as a hegemony cruiser dropped out of hyperspace right on top of the station. "We're clear," Lyra breathed, her voice filled with a mixture of relief and terror. "But we're officially the most wanted people in the galaxy, and we don't even have our own ship anymore." I looked at the data disk in my hand. "We have something better," I said. "We have a map, and we have a purpose." I thought about the man in my vision. Courage is the wind. I wasn't a hero. I was just a man who was tired of running. But as I looked at Lyra, seeing the determination in her eyes despite the fear, I realized that I wasn't alone. We were a family of 2, and we were going to find the rest of the Aegis, even if we had to tear the galaxy apart to do it. "Set a course for the coordinates on the disk, Lyra," I said, sheathing the sword. "Let's see what else my ancestors left behind." The small ship banked, its engines flaring with a bright, defiant light as we vanished into the darkness of the dead gas giant's shadow. The hunt was on, but for the first time in 10,000 years, the prey had teeth. The needle ship, which Lyraia had dubbed the Shard with a half-hearted shrug, felt less like a vessel and more like a pressurized coffin as we drifted through the Veil of Whispers. The nebula was a roiling graveyard of violet gas and ionized dust that played hell with our sensors. Every 10 minutes, the hull would groan, a deep, metallic protest against the shifting gravitational tides of the sector. I sat in the navigator's chair, the atavistic key propped against the bulkhead beside me. It was quiet now, but the weight of it in the room was undeniable. It felt like sitting next to a sleeping predator, one that might wake up and decide your throat looked particularly appetizing. "Kay, you've been staring at that data disk for 2 hours, Lyra murmured, her voice barely audible over the hum of the life support. She was hunched over the main power coupling, her fingers glowing a faint, agitated purple as she tried to coax another 5% of efficiency out of the aging reactor. "It's not going to reveal its secrets just because you're scowling at it." "Vrax didn't give us the whole story," I said, rubbing the bridge of my nose. "This disk contains encrypted navigation logs, but the timestamps, they don't make sense. Some of these files are 5,000 years old, but others were updated as recently as 50 years ago. Someone has been visiting the Aegis sites, Lyra. Someone who wasn't a scavenger. Probably hegemony spooks," she said, wiping a streak of black grease from her cheek. "They've been trying to reverse engineer atavistic tech since the day they crawled out of the primordial soup. They're obsessed with it, Kay. They see it as their birthright, even though they can't even turn on a toaster without a manual." "It's more than that," I replied, standing up and pacing the 3 meters of floor space available. "The vision I had, the Aegis didn't just hide. They pruned themselves. They cut away the parts of our history that made us powerful because they were afraid of what we were becoming. It wasn't just about the entropists. It was about us." I stopped in front of the viewport. Outside, the nebula shifted, revealing a glimpse of the absolute blackness of the void. My reflection looked back at me, tired, haunted, and far too small for the destiny that was currently strapped to my back. "I'm just a guy who used to steal catalytic converters from derelict freighters, Lyra," I whispered. "I'm not a guardian. I'm not a king. I'm just me, and I'm terrified that I'm going to screw this up and take you down with me." Lyra stood up, her bioluminescent hair casting long, flickering shadows against the walls. She walked over and stood beside me, her shoulder pressing against mine. "Fear is the anchor, Kay. You told me that's what the voice said. It's okay to be scared. Only the dead aren't afraid in this sector. But you didn't drop the blade when the enforcers showed up. You didn't run when the mercenaries had us zeroed." "I didn't have a choice," I said. "You always have a choice," she countered softly. "You chose to stay for me on Xylos-Four. You chose to fight at the outpost. Don't let the ghosts in your head take away the credit for being a decent man." I was about to say something snarky to break the tension when the ship suddenly lurching to the port side. The lights flickered and died, replaced by the harsh, strobing red of the emergency power. "Status!" I yelled, grabbing the edge of the console. "I don't know." Lyra was already back at the controls, her hands moving in a blurred frenzy. "The reactor is still online, but the energy, it's being sucked out. Something is draining the ship's heat, Kay. We're losing thermal integrity." I looked at the viewport, and my blood turned to ice. The nebula wasn't violet anymore. It was gray, a flat, lifeless color that seemed to eat the very concept of light. A tear had appeared in the fabric of space, less than 50 meters from our bow. It wasn't a black hole. It was worse. It was a jagged crack in reality, and from it, something was seeping out. It looked like smoke made of obsidian, swirling into shapes that defied the eye. It had no face, no limbs, but it radiated a malice so cold, it felt like a physical weight pressing on my chest. "The entropist," I breathed. "The sensors are flatlining." Lyra's voice was climbing toward a scream. "It's not registering as matter or energy. It's a hole in the universe, Kay. We're being pulled in." The ship began to vibrate, a high-pitched metallic shriek that set my teeth on edge. The temperature in the cockpit dropped 20 degrees in seconds. My breath came out in a white cloud. The shadow thing drifted closer, its form expanding until it blocked out the stars. I could hear it now, 1,000 whispers overlapping, a chorus of voices telling me that hope was an illusion, that the universe was cold and empty, and that my life was nothing but a flickering candle in a hurricane of darkness. "Give it to us," the whispers hissed. "The key is the lock. The lock is the end." Return to the silence. "Kay, I can't hold the ship!" Lyra cried out. She was slumped over the controls, her skin turning a sickly, translucent white. The entity was feeding on her light, her very essence. The fear hit me then, not the sharp electric fear of a firefight, but a deep, paralyzing dread. I wanted to crawl into a corner and wait for the end. I wanted to let the cold take me. It would be so easy. No more running, no more being hunted, just the long, quiet sleep. My hand brushed the hilt of the atavistic key. The sapphire light erupted, cutting through the red emergency strobes. It wasn't just a glow. It was a defiant roar. The warmth flooded back into my arm, shattering the paralysis. I grabbed the blade and stood up. The sword wasn't heavy anymore. It felt like a part of my own skeleton. I stepped toward the viewport, the blue fire of the blade reflecting in the gray smoke of the entity. "Not today, you void-sucking freak," I growled. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have training. I only had the image of Lyra, dying in the pilot's seat, and the stubborn human refusal to go quietly into the night. I didn't swing the sword. I thrust it forward, focusing every ounce of my will, every memory of warmth, every scrap of love I had for the life I'd lived, into the steel. The key responded. A pillar of pure, brilliant light shot from the tip of the blade, piercing the viewport without breaking the glass. It struck the center of the obsidian shadow. The screams that filled the cabin weren't human. They were the sounds of 1,000 dying stars. The entity recoiled, its form shredded by the radiance. The gray smoke turned to ash, dissolving into the nebula. The tear in reality snapped shut with a sound like a thunderclap, sending a shock wave that tossed the shard through space like a toy. I fell back into the co-pilot's seat, the sword clattering to the floor. The lights flickered back to steady white. The heat began to return, the life support humming with a renewed, frantic energy. For a long minute, there was only the sound of our ragged breathing. Kay? Lyra groaned, slowly lifting her head from the console. Her color was returning, the soft teal of her skin a beautiful sight in the aftermath of the gray. I'm here, I rasped, my throat feeling like I'd swallowed glass. I'm here, Lyra. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a combination of terror and something that looked suspiciously like reverence. You drove it back. I felt it, Kaylin. The cold. It was going to erase me. And then you didn't let it. I was scared to death, I admitted, my hands finally starting to shake. I almost let go. I almost just let it happen. But you didn't, she said, her voice steadying. She stood up and walked over to me, kneeling on the floor and taking my hands in hers. That's the difference, Kay. Being a guardian isn't about being untouchable. It's about being vulnerable and standing your ground anyway. You chose to fight for me. You chose to stay in the light. I looked down at the sword. It was dark again, resting quietly on the deck plates. It had saved us, but I knew this was only the beginning. The entropists weren't just a myth anymore. They were real, and they were hungry. We need to get to those coordinates, Lyra, I said, my voice hardening with a newfound resolve. If there's an archive on Xylos-9, we need to find it before the hegemony, or those things do. We're not just scavengers anymore. We're the only ones who know how to keep the door shut. Lyra nodded, her fingers tightening on mine for a second before she stood up and returned to the pilot's seat. Course laid in, Kaylin. Engaging the jump drive. Let's go see what your ancestors were so afraid of. As the ship jumped into the white void of hyperspace, I realized that the fear hadn't gone away. It was still there, a cold knot in the pit of my stomach. But it wasn't an anchor anymore. It was a reminder of why I was fighting. I wasn't just surviving, I was protecting. And for a man who had spent his whole life running, that felt like the most dangerous and most important thing I'd ever done. Xylos-9 was a tomb of ice and silence. The moon was a jagged sphere of frozen methane and rock, orbiting a dying red dwarf star that cast a long, bloody shadow across the surface. There was no atmosphere to speak of, only the biting, airless cold that could freeze a man solid in 3 seconds if his suit's seals failed. We landed the shard in a deep lunar crater, hidden from the long-range scans of any passing hegemony patrols. The descent had been harrowing, the moon's uneven gravity tugging at the ship like a hungry ghost, but Lyra had handled it with her usual, terrifying precision. We have 2 hours of oxygen in the portable tanks, Kay, she said, checking the seals on her pressure suit. Her sirenite features were obscured by the gold-tinted visor of her helmet, but I could hear the tension in her voice. If we don't find the entrance by then, we're going to be very well-preserved statues. The signal is coming from the base of the central spire, I said, checking the handheld scanner Vrax had given me. There's a resonance signature that matches the sword. It's buried deep, Lyra, at least 400 meters below the ice. We stepped out onto the surface, our boots crunching against the frozen methane. The silence was absolute, a heavy, suffocating thing that made every breath sound like a gale-force wind inside my helmet. I carried the atavistic key in its canvas wrap, the weight of it a familiar comfort against my back. We trekked across the crater floor, our movements slow and deliberate in the low gravity. The central spire loomed above us, a jagged tooth of black obsidian that seemed to have been thrust up from the core of the moon. It wasn't a natural formation. As we got closer, I could see the geometric precision of the edges, the faint, shimmering lines of atavistic circuitry embedded in the stone. "Look at this," Lyra whispered, her voice crackling through the comms. She knelt at the base of the spire, brushing away a layer of frost. Beneath the ice was a panel of living metal, its surface rippling like liquid silver. "This is Aegis tech, but it's different. It's older than the stuff on Xylos-Four. This isn't a weapon depot, it's a repository." I stepped forward, and as I approached, the silver metal began to pulse with a soft sapphire light. The sword on my back responded, a low hum vibrating through my suit. "It knows I'm here," I said. The panel didn't slide open, it dissolved. 1 second there was a solid wall of metal, and the next there was a yawning tunnel of blue-lit stone leading down into the heart of the moon. We followed the tunnel for what felt like miles. The air inside was pressurized, a gift from the ancient systems that had somehow remained online for 5 millennia. We cracked our helmets, and the air that hit my lungs was stale and smelled of ozone and ancient dust, but it was breathable. The tunnel opened into a vast, circular chamber. It was a cathedral of knowledge. Row upon row of crystalline pillars stretched up into the darkness, each one glowing with a faint, internal light. Holographic displays flickered in the air, showing maps of star systems that no longer existed and schematics for machines that defied the laws of modern physics. In the center of the chamber stood a raised dais, and upon it sat a single, pulsing sphere of white light. The heart of the archive, Lyra breathed, her eyes wide with wonder. She approached a nearby pillar, her fingers hovering inches from the crystal. Kay, this is it, everything. The history of the Aegis, their science, their art, their failures. I walked toward the dais, the atavistic key held in my hand. As I stepped onto the platform, the white sphere flared, and a hologram materialized in the air above it. It was a woman. She was tall, with dark skin and eyes that seemed to hold the weight of entire galaxies. She wore a simple, functional uniform, the same white armor I'd seen in my visions. Identity confirmed, the woman's voice said. It was melodic but possessed a crystalline clarity that made my neck hair stand up. Welcome, Guardian Vance. You are 10,422 days late for your rotation. I'm not a guardian, I said, my voice cracking. I'm a scavenger. My name is Kalen. The DNA does not lie, Kalen Vance, the hologram replied, her gaze fixing on me with an intensity that felt physical. You are the descendant of the High Sentinel bloodline, the failsafe. You have returned because the shadows have begun to lengthen. The entropists have breached the first veil. We saw one, Lyra said, stepping up to the dais. It tried to destroy our ship. Kalen drove it back with the sword. The hologram turned to Lyra, her expression softening slightly. A Sirenite. It is good to see the old alliances still hold. But the entity you faced was merely a scout, a fragment of the hunger that waits in the void. Tell us the truth, I demanded, stepping closer. Why did you do it? Why did the Aegis erase themselves? Why did you leave us in the dark, struggling to survive while the hegemony turned the galaxy into a playground for tyrants? The woman's image flickered, a momentary glitch in the ancient projection. We did not erase ourselves out of fear of the enemy, Kalen. We erased ourselves out of fear of our own power. The Aegis had become gods. We shaped worlds. We harnessed the power of suns, and we began to believe that our order was the only order. We were becoming the very thing we fought, an absolute force that left no room for the growth of others. She gestured to the crystalline pillars. The great erase was a choice of humility. We dismantled our empire and scattered our knowledge so that the younger races, including our own, could grow without the shadow of our perfection. We left the failsafe, the key and the bloodline, only as a last resort should the entropists return before the galaxy was ready to face them. Well, the galaxy isn't ready, I yelled, the frustration of a lifetime of being a third-tier citizen boiling over. We're fighting each other for scraps of your old trash. The hegemony is hunting us for this sword, and they have no idea what they're doing. You didn't give us a chance to grow. You gave us a death sentence. The hologram was silent for a long moment. Perhaps, she said softly, the calculations of 5,000 years ago did not account for the cruelty of those who would rise in our absence. For that, I offer the apology of a dead empire, but the situation remains. The cage is failing because the heart of the galaxy, the Great Seal, is being corrupted from within. Within? Lyra asked. You mean the hegemony? The hegemony of Accord is a symptom, not the cause, the woman replied. They seek power, but they are being manipulated. There is a presence among them, an entropist that has taken a physical form, a parasite that feeds on the ambition of the ruling council. They believe they are building an empire. In truth, they are building a bridge for the void. The turning point hit me then, a cold realization that made the room spin. We weren't just running from a corrupt government. We were running from a cancer that had already consumed the heart of the galaxy. We have to stop them, I said, looking at Lyra. Kay, we're two people in a stolen scout ship, she said, her voice trembling. How are we supposed to take on the entire Hegemony Council? You are not two people, the hologram said. You are the sparks that must light the fire. The atavistic key can awaken the sleeping defenses of the Aegis, but it requires more than just DNA. It requires a synthesis of resonance. The human bloodline provides the authority, but the Sirenite resonance provides the focus. The woman looked at Lyra. Your people, Lyraia Vox, were the ones who designed the harmonics of the Great Seal. You are not just a navigator, you are the voice of the machine. Together you can reactivate the heart of light. Suddenly, a loud metallic thud vibrated through the floor of the chamber. Dust fell from the ceiling, and the blue lights flickered. Sensors are picking up multiple atmospheric entries, Lyra said, her hands flying to her helmet comms. Kay, they found us. Hegemony dropships. At least 6 of them. They must have tracked the energy flare from the spire. They are here for the heart, the hologram said, her image beginning to fade. If they seize the archive, the Entropist parasite will have the maps it needs to tear down the seal from the inside. You must take the core, Kalen. You must take it and go to the Crimson Sector. There you will find the ruins of the first citadel. The core? I looked at the white sphere of light. How do I take it? Touch the sword to the dais, she commanded. And remember, Guardian, courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision that something else is more important than your own safety. Protect each other. The bond you share is the only thing the void cannot comprehend. I didn't hesitate. I drew the atavistic key and pressed the tip of the blade into the dais. The room exploded in white light. The sphere of light shrank, condensing into a small, pulsing crystal that hovered in the air. I grabbed it, the energy of the archive surging through my body, making my vision swim. Let's go! I yelled, grabbing Lyra's hand. We raced back through the tunnel, the stone walls groaning as the ancient facility began to self-destruct to prevent the hegemony from accessing the rest of the data. We reached the surface just as the first dropship landed 100 meters away. White-armored enforcers poured out of the craft, their pulse rifles already firing. To the ship, I shouted, the sword blazing in my hand. The low gravity allowed us to make massive leaps, dodging the orange beams of the enforcers' rifles. I swung the blade, sending waves of kinetic energy into the ground to kick up clouds of methane ice, obscuring their vision. We reached the shard just as another dropship began its descent, its belly cannons aiming for our engines. Lyra, get us out of here! I scrambled into the airlock, the sounds of pulse fire clattering against the hull. The ship lurched, the engines screaming as Lyra pushed them past the red line. We shot off the surface of Xylos-9, weaving through the crossfire of the orbiting hegemony cruisers. We're clear of the moon, Lyra gasped, her face pale as she wrestled with the controls. But Kay, the whole sector is crawling with them. And that thing the hologram said about the parasite in the hegemony, if that's true, there's no one we can trust. I looked at the crystal core in my hand, then at the sword, and finally at Lyra. The humanistic lesson I'd been avoiding was staring me in the face. I had been looking for a way to save myself, to find a corner of the galaxy where I could be left alone. But the universe wasn't going to let me. My ancestors had tried to save the galaxy by hiding. They had tried to protect it by erasing the very things that made them strong. And in doing so, they had left us defenseless against a horror they couldn't even name. We're not hiding anymore, Lyra, I said, my voice low and steady. We're not scavengers looking for scraps. We're the ones who are going to finish what they started. We're going to the first citadel. That's suicide, Kay, she whispered, but she was already entering the coordinates. You know that, right? I know, I said, reaching out and taking her hand, but I'm not doing it alone. And I'd rather die fighting for something real than live 1,000 years in a galaxy that's already dead. The shard jumped, leaving the bloody light of the red dwarf behind. We were heading into the heart of the storm, armed with a broken history and a sword that remembered a time when we were kings. The turning point was behind us. Ahead lay only the fire. The Crimson Sector did not welcome visitors. It tolerated survivors. As the shard punched out of hyperspace, we were greeted by a horizon of roiling, blood-colored gas clouds that stretched for light years in every direction. This was the eye of a galactic hurricane, a place where gravity wells shifted like sand dunes, and ancient radiation played a discordant symphony against the hull. Navigating this red soup was like trying to fly through a thick liquid while blindfolded, and only a pilot with Lyraia's specific resonance could find the narrow, stable lanes hidden within the chaos. Kay, look at the long-range sweep, Lyra whispered, her voice tight with a mixture of exhaustion and dread. Her skin was a pale, translucent indigo, a sign that she had been pushing her sirenite abilities to the breaking point to keep us from being crushed by the atmospheric pressure of the sector. I leaned over her shoulder, squinting at the flickering green display. Scattered across the red void were hundreds of metallic signatures. They weren't moving. They were static, drifting like the bones of a leviathan. "The graveyard of the First Fleet," I muttered, the words feeling heavy in my mouth. According to the Corps, this was where the Aegis fought the final battle of the first incursion. Thousands of ships, 5,000 years of silence. "It's beautiful in a terrifying way," Lyra said, her fingers twitching as she adjusted the thrusters to avoid a drifting hull the size of a city. "But we aren't here for a history lesson. Silas's coordinates are leading us toward the Rift Eye. If he's still alive and holding that outpost, we might actually have a chance to ground the shard before the hegemony cruisers catch our scent." Silas Vane. He was an old ghost from my past, a man who had taught me how to strip a fusion core before I was 10 years old. He was a human who had survived the worst the hegemony could throw at him, a smuggler who claimed to have found the edge of the universe and didn't like what he saw. If anyone knew how to hide from a galactic empire, it was him. But trust was a currency I didn't have much of, especially now that I was carrying the most valuable object in existence. We descended through a thick layer of ionized sulfur, the ship shaking so violently that I feared the atmospheric seals would burst. Then, like a curtain being pulled back, the clouds parted. Nestled within a hollowed-out moonlet was a jagged needle of black iron, the Spire of Thorns. It was a fortress of scrap and stolen technology, bristling with illegal defense turrets and sensor jammers. "We have a hailing frequency," Lyra announced. "It's an old-school encrypted line." "Put it through," I said, adjusting the weight of the atavistic key on my back. "Kalen Vance," a voice crackled through the speakers. It was deep, rasping, and sounded like a shovel hitting dry earth. "I heard you were dead in a ditch on Xylos-Four. I should have known better. Only the cockroaches and the Vances survive a planetary lockdown." "Silas," I replied, a ghost of a smile touching my lips despite the tension. "I'm coming in hot. I have the hegemony on my tail and a cargo that makes your usual contraband look like children's toys. Can you hold the door?" "The door is always open for family, boy," Silas said. "Land in Bay 7, and tell your blue friend to keep her hands off the ship's internal diagnostics." My station is temperamental. The landing was a tooth-rattling affair, the shard sliding onto the metal deck with a screech of tortured alloy. As the airlock hissed open, the smell of burnt oil and stale tobacco flooded the cabin. I stepped out first, the sword pulsing a low, steady sapphire beneath its canvas wrap. Silas was waiting for us. He looked exactly as I remembered, a mountain of a man with skin like weathered leather and a mechanical eye that glowed a dull, predatory red. He was flanked by a dozen heavily armed mercenaries, a mix of humans and scarred aliens who looked like they had been forged in the fires of 100 border wars. "Kalen," Silas boomed, stepping forward to clasp my forearm in a grip that would have crushed a weaker man's bones. "You look like you've been through the grinder, and this must be the famous Sirenite I've heard so much about." Lyraia stepped out behind me, her eyes darting between the mercenaries with practiced caution. "Lyraia Vox," she said, her voice cool and professional. "Thank you for the harbor, Commander Vane." "Enough with the titles," Silas laughed, though the sound didn't reach his mechanical eye. "Come inside. We have much to discuss and very little time. My scouts say the hegemony inquisitors are combing the sector. They're burning entire stations just to find a lead on you." We followed him into the heart of the spire, a labyrinth of cramped corridors and flickering lights. Silas led us to a private chamber protected by a heavy blast door. Inside, the walls were covered in monitors displaying tactical maps of the Crimson Sector. "Sit," Silas commanded, gesturing to a table made of a recycled ship bulkhead. "I've seen the reports, Kay. They say you found it, the weapon of the Aegis, the sword that can cut through reality itself." "It's not just a weapon, Silas," I said, sitting down but keeping the sword close. "It's a responsibility. The entropists are returning. The Great Seal is failing because of something inside the hegemony." Silas leaned back, his mechanical eye whirring as it focused on the canvas-wrapped blade. I know about the parasites, boy. I've seen what they do to a man's soul. They turn ambition into a virus. But you have to understand something. The hegemony isn't just a government anymore. It's a cult, and they will never stop until they have that key. He stood up and walked to a display, his back turned to us. Do you know why I stayed out here in the red soup? I wasn't just hiding. I was waiting. Waiting for the day a human would finally wake up and realize we weren't meant to be the galaxy's janitors. Silas, Lyra said, her voice suddenly sharp. Why are your internal sensors suddenly broadcasting an encrypted burst toward the outer nebula? I froze. My hand moved instinctively toward the hilt of the sword. Silas? Silas turned around, and the expression on his face made my stomach drop. It wasn't anger. It was a terrible, weary sadness. I'm sorry, Kalen. I really am. But the galaxy doesn't need a hero right now. It needs order. And the High Inquisitor promised me that if I delivered the key, the humans of the Crimson Sector would finally be given a seat at the table. We'd be citizens again. No more hiding. No more scraps. You sold us out, I whispered, the betrayal cutting deeper than any blade. You sold your own blood to the people who erased us. I'm saving us, Silas roared, his voice trembling with a desperate conviction. 1 life for 10 billion. That's the math of a survivor, Kay. You should know that better than anyone. The blast door hissed open, but it wasn't the mercenaries who entered. It was a squad of hegemony inquisitors, their silver armor polished to a mirror finish. At their head walked a man who looked like he was made of glass in cold light. High Inquisitor Vane, Silas's namesake, his own son, who had been taken by the hegemony years ago to be groomed into a monster. The parasite was visible beneath the skin of the Inquisitor's neck, a writhing black vein that pulsed with an unnatural rhythm. His eyes were entirely black, voids that sucked the light out of the room. The High Sentinel, the Inquisitor said, his voice a chorus of 1,000 hollow whispers. Hand over the key, and the Sirenite will be allowed to live as a servant in the High Court. Refuse, and I will let the void consume her mind while you watch. Kay, run! Lyra yelled, her skin erupting in a blinding flare of indigo light. She let out a sonic scream that shattered the monitors and sent the Inquisitors stumbling back. I drew the atavistic key. The room was flooded with sapphire brilliance as the blade recognized the presence of the Entropus parasite. The air hummed with a violent electric energy. I lunged at the Inquisitor, but Silas threw his massive frame in my way, his mechanical arm locking around my throat. Don't make it worse, boy, Silas grunted, his eyes filled with tears. Just give it to them. I kicked Silas back, the sword's energy throwing him into the bulkhead, but I was too slow. 2 Inquisitors had grabbed Lyra, their silver gauntlets glowing with a dampening field that neutralized her resonance. She gasped, her light flickering and dying, as they dragged her toward the door. No! I screamed, but a pulse of dark energy from the High Inquisitor hit me in the chest, throwing me across the room. My vision blurred, the world spinning into a haze of red and black. Take the girl to the processing chamber, the Inquisitor commanded. Leave the human. He cannot activate the heart without her resonance, and he will eventually crawl to us to save her. Love is such a convenient tether. I tried to stand, but my body felt like it was made of lead. I watched as the door slammed shut, taking Lyra away into the darkness of the spire. Silas stood over me, his face a mask of shame. You don't understand, Kay, Silas whispered, looking down at his mechanical hand. You can't win this. They are too many. I looked at the atavistic key, which was still glowing faintly on the floor beside me. The betrayal was complete. My mentor had sold me, my partner was a prisoner, and the galaxy was slipping into the void. But as the darkness tried to claim me, I felt a flicker of that ancient human stubbornness. Silas had chosen survival at the cost of his soul. I was going to choose my soul, even if it cost me the universe. I grabbed the sword, the sapphire light burning through the red haze. I wasn't just a scavenger anymore, and I wasn't a guardian of some dead empire. I was Kalen Vance, and I was going to get my family back. The bowels of the Spire of Thorns were a nightmare of grinding gears and hissing steam. I moved through the shadows like a ghost, the atavistic key sheathed on my back, but its warmth still seeping through my tactical suit. Every breath I took felt like I was inhaling ground glass, my chest still bruised from the Inquisitor's dark pulse. I wasn't sneaking anymore. I was hunting. I found the first guard station near the processing levels. 3 Valerian mercenaries were lounging around a table, gambling with tarnished credits. They didn't even have time to reach for their rifles. I didn't use the sword. I used the shadows and a jagged piece of scrap metal I'd picked up in the vents. It was fast, quiet, and brutal, the way a scavenger fights when he has nothing left to lose. I accessed the security terminal with a series of frantic, shaking commands. The maps of the spire were a mess, but I found the signature I was looking for. Lyra's resonance was a faint, guttering candle in the dark, located 3 levels below in the void chamber. They were preparing to use her as a conduit to bridge the gap between our reality and the entropist dimension. "Kay, can you hear me?" The voice wasn't on the comms. It was inside my head, a faint, melodic echo that tasted like salt and ozone. "Lyra, I can hear you," I thought, squeezing my eyes shut. "Hold on, I'm coming." "It's cold, Kay," she whispered. "The blackness. It's not just around me. It's inside. The Inquisitor. He's not a man anymore. He's a doorway. You have to destroy the chamber, even if I'm still inside. You have to close the door." I stopped in the middle of a dark corridor, my hand gripping the hilt of the sword so hard my knuckles turned white. "I am not leaving you, Lyra. Not for the galaxy. Not for the Aegis. We are a family and we don't leave people behind." "Family is a choice, Kaylin." Her voice drifted away, growing weaker. "Choose the light. Choose the stars. Don't let them take everything." I didn't answer. I couldn't. I began to run, my boots echoing against the metal floor. I didn't care about stealth anymore. I didn't care if the whole station knew I was coming. I reached the entrance to the void chamber, a massive circular door made of reinforced carbon steel. 2 heavy-duty defense turrets swiveled toward me, their barrels glowing with orange heat. I drew the atavistic key. The sapphire light erupted, but it was different this time. It wasn't just bright, it was focused. I felt the memories of the High Sentinels flooding back, but I pushed them aside. I didn't want their cold logic. I didn't want their sacrifice. I wanted my partner. I swung the blade in a vertical arc. A wave of blue kinetic energy slashed through the air, shearing the turrets off their mounts before they could fire a single shot. I stepped up to the door and plunged the blade into the locking mechanism. The steel screamed as the sword's energy melted through the alloy like it was wax. I kicked the door open and stepped into the chamber. The room was a vast, hollow sphere. At its center, Lyra was suspended in a cage of dark energy, her skin glowing a frantic, sickly violet. Around her, 6 Inquisitors stood in a circle, their hands raised as they channeled a torrent of black smoke toward a tear in reality that was slowly opening above her head. High Inquisitor Vane stood at the edge of the abyss, his black eyes fixed on the growing rift. "You are late, Guardian," the Inquisitor said, his voice echoing in the hollow space. "The bridge is almost complete. Your bloodline provided the key, but her resonance provides the power. Once the doors open, your sword will be nothing more than a souvenir of a dead race." I looked at Lyra. She was dying. The black smoke was wrapping around her heart, snuffing out the light that made her who she was. The humanistic choice I had to make was clear, and it was the most terrifying thing I'd ever faced. The Aegis would have told me to kill her. They would have told me to destroy the conduit to save the galaxy. That was the courage they preached, the courage of the cold and the lonely. But I wasn't an Aegis. I was a human. "Lyra!" I yelled, my voice cracking with emotion. "Look at me!" She turned her head, her eyes clouded with the void. "Remember the Nomad?" I shouted, stepping toward the center of the room, the sword blazing in my hand. "Remember the coffee and the bad jokes? Remember Xylos-Four? You are not a tool. You are Lyraia Vox, and you are my sister." The Inquisitors laughed, a hollow rattling sound. "Emotion is a flaw," the High Inquisitor hissed. "It is the weakness that allowed the Aegis to fall." "It's the only thing that's going to stop you," I growled. I didn't attack the Inquisitors. I didn't attack the rift. I turned the blade toward myself. I pressed the flat of the sapphire steel against my own chest, right over my heart. "Kaylin, no!" Silas's voice came from the doorway. He had followed me, his face pale with horror. The feedback will kill you. I ignored him. I focused on the bond I shared with Lyra, the months of arguments, the shared dangers, the quiet moments in the galley. I offered my own life force, my own human stubbornness, to the blade. I didn't want to be a guardian. I wanted to be a bridge. The sword responded to my intent. The blue light turned to a brilliant, blinding white. It wasn't the light of a weapon anymore. It was the light of a synthesis. My DNA and Lyra's resonance began to harmonize through the blade, creating a frequency that the void couldn't comprehend. The dark energy cage around Lyra shattered. The Inquisitors screamed as the white light hit them, their silver armor melting as the parasites inside them were incinerated by the purity of the resonance. The High Inquisitor recoiled, his glass-like skin cracking as the rift above him began to implode. Lyra fell from the center of the room. I dropped the sword and caught her, the momentum sending us both sliding across the floor. The chamber was collapsing. The rift was snapping shut, pulling the black smoke back into the void with a sound like a dying universe. The Spire of Thorns groaned, the gravity jammers failing as the station began to break apart under the strain of the energy surge. "Kay," Lyra whispered, her eyes clearing. Her skin was a soft, steady teal again. You did it. You broke the logic. I'm a scavenger, I wheezed, my chest feeling like it was on fire. We don't follow the rules. Silas reached us, his mechanical arms sparking. We need to go. The station is going down. My ship is in Bay 9. I grabbed the atavistic key, which was now pulsing with a gentle, warm light. I looked at Silas. I wanted to kill him for what he'd done. I wanted to leave him to rot in the ruins of his own betrayal. But I looked at Lyra, and I remembered the lesson. If I became the monster to fight the monster, the void had already won. Get her to the ship, Silas, I said, shoving Lyra toward him. What about you? Lyra grabbed my hand. I have to finish this, I said, looking toward the High Inquisitor. He was still alive, crawling toward a piece of fallen tech, his black eyes filled with a desperate, mindless hunger. If he escapes, the parasite just finds a new host. I'll meet you at the Nomad, I promised, kissing her forehead. Go. Silas hesitated, then nodded, slinging Lyra over his shoulder and running toward the emergency exits. I turned back to the High Inquisitor. The spire was screaming now, metal tearing as we drifted toward the event horizon of the gas giant below. Why? The Inquisitor rasped, the black smoke leaking from his cracked skin. You could have ruled. With the key and the girl, you could have been the new Aegis. We tried that, I said, standing over him. It didn't work. We're trying something else now. I didn't use the sword to kill him. I used it to heal the tear in his soul. I plunged the blade into the floorboards at his feet, releasing the last of the white resonance. The energy washed over him, and for a split second, the blackness in his eyes faded. He looked at me, really looked at me, with the eyes of a man who had finally woken up from a nightmare. Thank you, he whispered. Then the floor gave way. I threw myself toward the maintenance shaft as the void chamber collapsed into the furnace of the gas giant. I fell through the dark, my suit's thrusters firing in short, desperate bursts. I reached Bay 9 just as Silas's ship was lifting off. The ramp was down. Lyra was standing there, her hand outstretched. I jumped. The transition from the falling station to the deck of the ship was a blur of motion and pain. I hit the metal hard, the atavistic key clattering beside me. Lyra was on top of me in seconds, her cool hands on my face, her tears hitting my visor. You're an idiot, she sobbed. A complete and utter human idiot. I know, I smiled, my vision starting to fade into a peaceful darkness. But I'm your idiot. As the ship cleared the crimson sector, leaving the burning ruins of the Spire of Thorns behind, I felt a change in the air. The sword wasn't just a heavy burden anymore. It was light. It was a part of us. We hadn't just saved a life. We had proven that the Aegis were wrong. The galaxy didn't need to be protected by gods. It needed to be protected by people who were brave enough to love each other in the dark. The transformation had begun. It was painful, and it had cost us everything we thought we knew. But as I looked at the stars through the viewport, I knew we were finally heading home. Not to Earth and not to some ancient empire. We were heading toward the future we were going to build together. The silence inside the cockpit of Silas's ship, the Redemption's wake, was thicker than the hull plating. We were 3 days out from the Crimson Sector, cutting a jagged path through the riftward territories toward the first citadel. The ship was a heavy lifter, built for durability rather than speed, and every time the thrusters fired, the floor groaned like a dying beast. I sat on a crate of recycled rations, watching Lyraia. She was slumped in the pilot's seat, her head resting against the cold glass of the viewport. Her skin, usually a vibrant teal, had faded to a dull, milky blue. The void chamber had taken more from her than just energy. It had scraped at the very essence of her soul. "You should eat something," I said, my voice sounding like gravel under a boot. Lyra didn't turn around. "I can still feel it, Kay. The cold. It's like a splinter in my mind. Every time I close my eyes, I see that tear in reality. It wasn't just empty, it was hungry." I stood up, my muscles protesting the movement. My ribs were a map of purple and yellow bruises, and my lungs felt like they had been scrubbed with wire wool. I walked over and rested a hand on her shoulder. The atavistic key, now cleaned of the black soot from the spire, sat on the console between us. It wasn't pulsing anymore. It was waiting. "It's over, Lyra," I said, though I knew it was a lie. "We got out. We're going to finish this." "Is it?" She finally looked at me, her eyes clouded with a weary wisdom. "Silas is in the engine room, trying to fix a leak he caused by selling us to the highest bidder. The hegemony is probably 5 minutes behind us, with a fleet that could glass a dozen systems. And you're carrying a sword that wants you to be a god." She reached out and touched the hilt of the blade. "The Aegis were gods, Kay, and look what happened to them. They were so perfect they became a cage. I'm scared that if we win, we just become the new wardens." I didn't have an answer for her. I thought back to the vision of the woman in the archive. She had apologized for the cruelty of their absence. She had realized too late that purity is its own kind of poison. The door to the cockpit hissed open, and Silas Vane stepped in. He looked like he'd aged 20 years in the last 3 days. His mechanical eye was flickering, and he'd wrapped a dirty bandage around his forearm where the Inquisitor's energy had scorched him. "We're approaching the outer perimeter of the Citadel," Silas said, his voice devoid of its usual bluster. He wouldn't look me in the eye. He hadn't since we left the spire. "The sensors are picking up a lot of chatter. The hegemony isn't just following us. They're already there." "How many?" I asked. 30 cruisers, 2 dreadnoughts, and the High Command's flagship, the Sovereign," Silas replied, leaning against the bulkhead. "They've surrounded the Citadel's atmospheric shell. They're trying to crack it open with graviton beams." I looked at the map on the holographic display. The first Citadel was located at the heart of a massive, swirling nebula of gold and white gas. It wasn't just a building, it was a planetary-scale machine designed to anchor the Great Seal. If the hegemony broke through, they wouldn't just have the technology of the Aegis. They would have the ability to decide who lived and who died across the entire galaxy. "We can't fight 30 cruisers, Silas," Lyra said, her voice regaining some of its professional edge. "Even with the key, the shard is just a needle. We'll be dust before we hit the atmosphere." "We're not using the shard," I said, my gaze fixed on the atavistic key. "We're using the fleet." Silas frowned. "The fleet? Kay, the ships in the graveyard are 5,000 years old? They're husks. Even if you could turn them on, you'd need thousands of crews." "The key doesn't just turn them on," I said, the knowledge from the archive finally settling into place. "It synchronizes them. It creates a network. One mind, one intent." "One human," Lyra whispered, her eyes wide. "Kaylin, you saw what happened to the Aegis. They tried to be the mind for the whole galaxy. It broke them." "I'm not going to be the mind," I said, turning to face them both. "We are. The Aegis failed because they acted alone. They thought their DNA was the only authority that mattered. But the heart of light needs resonance. It needs the bond." I looked at Silas. "I know you're a coward, Silas. I know you sold us out because you were afraid of being a nobody in a universe of giants. But you're also the best combat pilot I've ever known. And you're human. You have the same spark in you that I do, even if you've tried to drown it in cheap ale and bad deals." Silas looked down at his hands, his shoulders slumped. I don't deserve to be part of this, Kay. I'm a Judas. I should have died on that station. Maybe, I said, stepping closer to him. But you didn't. And right now, I don't need a saint. I need a pilot who wants to earn his soul back. If you want to be a citizen, Silas, stop waiting for the hegemony to give you a seat. Take it. Silas was silent for a long moment. Then his mechanical eye stabilized, glowing a fierce, defiant red. He looked up, and for the first time in years, I saw the man who had taught me how to survive. Bay 9 has the long-range transmitter, he said, his voice regaining its gravelly strength. If we can get close enough to the graveyard, we can broadcast the synchronization pulse, but we'll be a sitting duck while the link establishes. I'll handle the defense, I said, reaching for the sword. And I'll handle the resonance, Lyra added, standing up and joining us. Her skin began to glow again, a soft, steady teal that looked like the first light of dawn. If we're going to be a cage, Kalen, let's make sure the bars are made of something better than pride. We spent the next 4 hours prepping the ship for the most insane suicide run in the history of the territories. Silas rewired the power couplings to boost the transmitter, while Lyra and I sat in the center of the hold, the atavistic key resting between us. We didn't talk. We didn't need to. Through the sword, I could feel her thoughts, the fear, the hope, the lingering cold of the void, and she could feel mine, the anger, the determination, and the quiet, desperate love that had become the anchor of my life. As we crossed the threshold into the Citadel's star system, the viewport was filled with the terrifying majesty of the hegemony fleet. The Sovereign loomed over the golden nebula like a silver shark, its massive beams of orange light tearing at the Citadel's shimmering shields. Here we go, Silas said, his hands blurring over the controls. Buckle up, kids. This is going to be a bumpy ride. The Redemption's wake lunged forward, its engines screaming as we dove into the thick of the debris field. The first hegemony cruiser detected us within seconds, its battery cannons opening fire. Orange bolts of energy splashed against our shields, making the ship groan and shudder. Transmitter is live, Lyra shouted, her hands pressed against the sapphire hilt of the sword. Kalen, now! I gripped the hilt and closed my eyes. I didn't reach for the power of the Aegis. I reached for the memories of every human who had ever struggled to find their way in the dark. I reached for Lyra's steady heart and Silas's frantic, redeeming courage. Awaken, I whispered. A pulse of pure white light erupted from the ship, rippling through the vacuum of space like a stone dropped into a still pond. It hit the first of the drifting Aegis husks, a jagged golden spire that had been silent for 5 millennia. The ship didn't just turn on, it breathed. Its lights flickered to life, its engines humming with a deep, resonant frequency that shook the very fabric of reality. Then another ship woke up, and another. 10, 50, 500. The graveyard was coming back to life. By the stars, Silas breathed, his eyes wide as he watched the ancient fleet take up formation around our tiny ship. They're beautiful. The hegemony fleet hesitated, their commanders frozen by the sight of 1,000 legends rising from the grave. But the Inquisitor's voice, amplified by the Sovereign's massive arrays, cut through the shock. Destroy them, the hollow whisper screamed. They are ghosts. Burn the husks and take the key. The battle for the first citadel had begun, but as the golden ships moved forward to meet the silver tide, I knew that this wasn't just a clash of fleets. It was the moment the galaxy had been waiting for since the beginning of time. It was the moment we stopped being victims of our history and started becoming the authors of our future. The void was no longer empty. It was a chaotic tapestry of gold and silver fire. The ancient Aegis ships moved with a fluidity that mocked the rigid formations of the hegemony. They didn't fire beams. They manipulated the space around their targets, creating localized gravity shears that crumpled the silver cruisers like tinfoil. But for every hegemony ship that fell, 2 more seemed to take its place. The Sovereign was a monster of a vessel, its shields absorbing the Aegis pulses with a terrifying ease. It was pushing through our line, its massive graviton beams focused entirely on the Redemption's wake. Shields are at 20%, Silas yelled, his hands a blur as he dodged a stray torpedo. Kay, the synchronization is holding, but the feedback is cooking the ship. We can't stay in the middle of this forever. We don't have to, I said, standing up. The atavistic key was glowing so brightly it was difficult to look at. The white light was no longer just around the blade. It was around me, weaving into the fabric of my suit. Lyra, I need you to take the link. All of it. Lyra looked at me, her face pale. Kalen, if I take the full resonance, I might not be able to come back. My mind, it'll be spread across 1,000 ships. I'll be there to pull you back, I promise, kneeling beside her. But I have to go to the Sovereign. The parasite is there, Lyra. It's the heart of the web. As long as it's alive, the entropists have a doorway. You're going to board a dreadnought? Alone? Silas turned his head, his mechanical eye whirring in disbelief. That's not courage, boy. That's a death wish. I'm not going alone, I said, looking at the sword. I'm taking 5,000 years of pissed-off ancestors with me. I didn't wait for an argument. I used the key to manipulate the local space, creating a micro-wormhole that connected the hold of the wake to the bridge of the Sovereign. It was a feat of power that should have killed me, but the bond with Lyra provided the stabilizing frequency. I love you, I whispered. Then come back, she replied, her voice sounding like a choir. I stepped through the rift. The bridge of the Sovereign was a cavernous hall of glass and chrome, filled with the scent of ozone and rot. High Inquisitor Vane sat in a throne of black crystal at the center, his skin now entirely transparent, revealing the writhing mass of black smoke that had replaced his internal organs. Around him, his officers were little more than husks, their eyes glowing with a mindless, dark light. The Guardian returns, the Inquisitor whispered, the sound vibrating in my very marrow. You have brought the key to its rightful master. Give it to me, and I will spare your little blue pet. I didn't say a word. I drew the blade and lunged. The battle was a blur of steel and shadow. The Inquisitor moved with the speed of a thought, his hands wreathed in black flame. Every time our blades met, the air exploded with a shock wave that shattered the glass viewports. We fought across the bridge, through the debris of fallen consoles and the bodies of the damned. I was losing. My human body was breaking under the strain of the Aegis power. My vision was tunneling, and every breath was a struggle against the crushing weight of the Inquisitor's malice. You are weak, Kalen Vance, the Inquisitor hissed, pinning me against a bulkhead with a wave of dark energy. You cling to these pathetic connections, love, loyalty, family. They are the anchors that will drown you. He raised his hand, a spear of obsidian smoke forming in the air. I looked at him, really looked at him, and I didn't feel anger. I felt pity. I saw the man he had once been, the son Silas had lost, and the tragedy of a soul that had given up its humanity for the sake of power. You're wrong, I wheezed, my hand finding the small crystal core in my pocket, the one we'd taken from Kalis-9. They aren't anchors, they're the wings. I didn't attack the Inquisitor. I slammed the core into the pommel of the atavistic key. The resulting explosion of light didn't destroy the ship. It didn't even hurt the Inquisitor. It was a wave of pure, unadulterated truth. It was the collective memory of the Aegis, combined with the raw, messy reality of my life. The Inquisitor screamed as the light flooded his mind. He saw the faces of the people he had killed. He felt the grief of his father. He felt the warmth of the sun on a world he had forgotten. The black parasite couldn't handle the resonance. It didn't belong in a world of feelings. It began to shrivel, turning to ash as the man inside fought to be free. Kalen! The Inquisitor gasped, his eyes turning human for a single fleeting second. Finish it. I didn't hesitate. I drove the blade into the center of the black throne. The great seal, which had been flickering and failing, suddenly surged with power. The light from the citadel below shot up into the sky, joining with the Aegis fleet in the Sovereign itself. The rift in reality snapped shut, not with a bang, but with a peaceful sigh. The entropists were gone, pushed back into the void by the one force they couldn't corrupt. The Sovereign began to tear itself apart, its dark engines imploding. I felt the pull of the vacuum, the cold of space reaching for me. Then a hand caught mine. It wasn't a physical hand. It was a projection of blue light, warm and firm. Lyra. I've got you, she whispered. The world went white. I woke up to the smell of real air, sweet, damp, and smelling of growing things. I was lying on a bed of soft, green moss at the base of a massive, silver-leaved tree. Above me, the sky was a deep, peaceful violet, dotted with more stars than I had ever seen. The first citadel loomed in the distance, no longer a jagged tooth of war, but a shining beacon of light that reflected in the crystalline lakes below. Lyra was sitting beside me, her skin a healthy, vibrant teal. She was weaving a crown of small, glowing flowers. "Where are we?" I asked, sitting up and realizing that for the first time in my life, nothing hurt. "The garden of the first citadel," she said, smiling. "The Aegis built it as a place of rest. I think they knew we'd need it." I looked around. A few hundred meters away, Silas was trying to fix a broken drone, his mechanical eye gleaming with a quiet contentment. He looked up and waved, a genuine grin on his face. He wasn't a citizen of the hegemony. He was a citizen of something new. The atavistic key lay on the moss beside me. It was just a sword now. No more pulses. No more voices. It had done its job. I looked at my hands. They were still the hands of a scavenger, scarred, rough, and stained with the dirt of 100 worlds. I hadn't become a god. I hadn't become a king. I had become a man who was no longer running. I spent 32 years believing that the universe was a cold, indifferent machine designed to grind the small and the weak into dust. I thought that survival was a solitary race, and that every person I met was either a predator or a hurdle. I wore my isolation like a suit of armor, thinking that if I didn't let anyone in, I couldn't be hurt. But standing here, under the light of 1,000 liberated stars, I realized how wrong I was. The Aegis didn't fall because they were weak. They fell because they forgot that power is meaningless without the people it's meant to protect. They tried to save the galaxy by removing themselves from it, and in doing so, they left a void that only fear could fill. I'm still just a human. I still have doubts, and I still get scared when the shadows get too long. But I know now that courage isn't the absence of that fear. It's the choice to reach out and take someone's hand when the world is ending. It's the decision to stay for a partner on a dying planet, and the willingness to forgive a father who lost his way. We aren't the guardians of the galaxy because of our DNA or our ancient swords. We are the guardians because we choose to love each other in a universe that tells us not to. And that, in the end, is the only weapon that ever truly mattered. I look at the horizon, where the first ships of the new coalition are beginning to land. Vessels from a dozen different species, all coming together not as subjects, but as equals. The hierarchy is dead. The era of the bond has begun. I used to think that the greatest mystery in the stars was who built the ancient gates and the silver citadels. I was wrong. The greatest mystery is how a species as small and fragile as ours can hold so much light without breaking. I wonder, as I sit here with my family, have you ever felt that spark? That sudden, terrifying realization that you are responsible for more than just your own survival? Is there someone in your life, a friend, a stranger, a partner, that you would walk into the absolute dark for without knowing if there was a light on the other side? Lyraia takes my hand, her fingers intertwining with mine, and for the first time, the silence of the universe feels like a promise. I pick up a handful of the silver soil and let it slip through my fingers, watching the dust catch the light of the new dawn. We're finally home.